Hello and welcome to Love Through It. I am so incredibly excited about this episode. I've been looking forward to it. I just finished Dr. Federica Amati's brand new book called Everybody Should Know This, and we should, truly. It's one of the best nutrition books I've ever read, and it's so much more than that. And I'm going to give you a little background on Federica. She's incredible. She is head nutritionist at Zoe and lecturer in nutrition at Imperial College School of Medicine. She has a PhD in clinical medicine research from Imperial College, has a master's in public health, is a registered nutritionist. I'm getting very excited here. She is a research fellow at King's College London with the NIHR ARC team at Imperial College. She is also non-exec assistant director at the NNED Pro Global Institute for Food, Nutrition, and Health. And finally, last but not least, works clinically as head of nutrition science for Well-Founded Health, which, if you remember, if you've been following the podcast for a bit, Dr. Jack, it's his company. Anyway, I always, especially with women who have incredible backgrounds, I just want to share all of that because I think it's expansive. And I just want to celebrate incredible women. So you guys are going to get so much from this. She shares science and tips from all across the spectrum of life, from conception to aging. It's an incredible conversation. I cannot wait. Check it out.
That is so useful. I love that.
I love it. I love that. Well, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. I've been so looking forward to this. So
me
nice
too. And rarely do I get to read an amazing book and then get to talk to the author like 2 days later. So this is like my nerdy English major fantasy in action.
Amazing. Well, it's so nice to actually speak to people who've read the full book because, oh my God, what do you think? Tell me what you think.
Well, I will totally say this. I was just saying this to Claire, my producer, before this. So as someone who has been a nerd and loves nutrition, I've been reading, I calculated diet books and nutrition books for 23 years. And I started in college after, freshman 15. I was like, what's going on with my body? I was always really curious. This has been hands down one of my favorite books I've read in 23 years.
Oh my gosh, that's awesome. Thank you so much. It's so good to hear.
And I think, A, because it's written by a woman and they're not enough. And
that's very true.
And B, your just outlook, it's not just a nutrition guide. You talk about the phases of life. And it just got me really excited that this is truly, and the book is called Everybody Should Know This. And they should, because you talk about conception, you talk about birth, you talk about menopause, breastfeeding, things that everyone really should know about. And so many of us, women included, are completely in the dark. So thank you for that.
Yeah, I think one of my main drivers for this book was really just to say, this is actually pretty basic stuff across the life course. So I've had questions from some of my readers who have said, I was really hoping that you could go into more detail on X, or I was hoping to find more about autism spectrum disorder, or could you tell me more about, celiac disease? And it's one of those things where I would love to do more of that, but it's ambitious to try and get the basics into one book because what I found was that there isn't another book that actually just gets the basics of the timeline in of, okay, this is what happens throughout our lives. These are some really important concepts like homeostasis and, tissue growth in pregnancy. These things are fundamental to our understanding of how physiology works and how nutrition can impact our health. And so it is, when I call it everybody should know this, it's really, for me, it's these real foundational concepts that then we build on for specific outcomes, for specific conditions. But these foundations are really universal. And, hopefully trying to put it all into one book, at one point I was like, am I actually going to be able to do this? Because it's quite a lot. But hopefully it can give everyone a grasp of these changes that happen throughout life and how we can help ourselves and help the ones we love to make the most of the windows of opportunity, but also to understand, if you read this book and maybe you're in your 60s and you don't have kids and you don't, like, but it can help you to understand your own health journey. Because by
Yes.
looking at how things change throughout life, you can be like, oh yes, well, it makes sense that like perhaps my cardiovascular risk is a bit higher because actually in hindsight in my 30s I was really stressed. So there's lots of different elements that can also help to unravel understanding the road to how we got to where we are,
Yeah.
as well as
Yeah.
like how can we now make the most of where we are for the future for ourselves, right? So that's
Absolutely.
what my intention was for the book, really.
And I think you pulled it off beautifully. And as someone, again, who has read a lot of nutrition and health books, there isn't anything else like that. And I learned stuff, and I was delighted. And so I have little tidbits I want to share. But talking about the journey to getting where we are, I loved reading your backstory. I want to ask, what was it like growing up in Italy the first 7 years of your life? How did that influence maybe how you look at food and diet now?
Do you know, I think in hindsight, obviously, it had a massive impact
Yeah.
because so much of our social activities, our timetabling was centered around food. So it's like the day was structured around meal times. It's like you wake up, you have breakfast, you go to school. And then in Italy, you break up for school. Like the school finishes at lunchtime, so you can go home and have lunch with your family.
Oh,
So I used
that's
to
so
like come
nice.
home for lunch. Yeah, I know. Come home for lunch and then have lunch and then do whatever afternoon activity was planned, or like sometimes it was going back to school after lunch to carry on with whatever. And so there's just the idea of like actually prioritizing food and prioritizing sharing our meals together was ingrained in me from a very young age. And then when I think back to, and of course, it's also a different era. Lianna, you know this, like we didn't have
Yes.
smartphones, we didn't have Netflix. So me and
No.
my brother used to go out and go to the sunflower fields near our house. So like we lived on like the kind of, not the outskirts, but sort of a more suburban area of Rome. And we had sunflower fields at the end of our garden, essentially. And we used to like break into the fields and pick sunflower seeds and eat them. And then we used to, so like foraging was our fun time. We used to, like also wild rocket grows on the street sides in Italy. So we
Wow.
used to like go and just forage wild rocket and bring it home and wash it for dinner. Like it was actually not knowingly, but food was so central to so many things.
Mhm.
And we always got together with friends and family on weekends and summer holidays, like the entire day revolved around food. And our grandmas would always prepare food to take to the beach in cooler bags, and we would watch them like make these delicious. We used to have these amazing stuffed tomatoes, like huge tomatoes that my grandma would like make this rice salad with tuna and olive and capers and like put it back in the tomato, and you take all these things that are peppered in my memory. My childhood is peppered with these memories of food and of sharing food, and all of our family photos of holidays are at the dinner table. So I think it did leave a massive imprint, mostly of the power of food to connect us and also
Yes.
the joy of eating. There's nothing more delicious than your packed lunch that your grandma made on the beach when you've been swimming loads and you're knackered and really hungry. Eating that
Yes.
food is just so good. Like I can taste it now. So yeah, I think it did have, actually, even though 7 years seems like a short time, it did have a big impact on my relationship with food and the importance I put on food. And of course, when we moved to the UK, my parents brought that food culture with us.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
we were that family here in London that it was, for me, it was like a non-negotiable to be at home for lunch on weekends. It was, doesn't matter
Yeah.
what play date situation was going on, or like that, it was just not a thing. Like we always have lunch together. And I still remember, now the rules have changed because of Brexit, but we used to bring entire suitcases of food back from Italy. So
Oh, wow.
before extra virgin olive oil was available in supermarkets, before good quality pasta was available in London, because in the 90s it really wasn't.
Oh, I
We,
bet. I
we
bet.
used to, yeah, we used to pack it into our luggage and bring it home with us. All the like leafy greens, the beans. Oh my gosh, the beans. So yeah, it was just a constant. It's been a constant theme in my life, but not one that has brought anything. Like it's just with joy and a real, I have to say, like a real pride of the heritage of Italian food. So
Oh,
I'm very international because I've spent most of my life living outside of Italy. But when you talk about Italian food, all of my Italianness just comes out. And it's like the end of the story that I will not uphold any debate about whether there's any cuisine that even comes close.
I
So
can
yeah.
feel the joy and the memories that you speak about. And I grew up in Maine, in the woods, right near an organic farm. So my childhood was spent barefoot, eating, picking corn and eating it off the stalk. So I really
Amazing.
resonate with that. Although the United States does not do nearly as good of a job as really, I mean, we definitely gathered around food, but I think there's a reverence in Italy and in Europe in general that living over here as an American, I really, really appreciate, because especially these days, food has just become this convenience that people are eating on the go by themselves out of a package that is often making them sick. So just hearing you speak about this is something I really hope that we can bring back into our culture everywhere.
Yeah, I mean, that would be amazing. I think reconnecting with how happy food can be. I think you're completely right. US and UK, we treat food as this like commodity that we have to eat just to like stay alive, and
Yeah.
to the point where we've regressed to powdered meals as like an actual option for lunch. I'm like, when did that happen? So I think the US and the UK, the problem is that food is either feared as
Hmm.
something to avoid, because otherwise you'll
Yeah.
like put on weight, or it might make you sick, or it's got glyphosate, or it's got sugar, and
Yes.
God forbid, and da da
Yes.
da da. There's so much fear mongering about food.
Yes.
So people are either terrified and frankly don't know what to eat, or
Yes.
they just see it as something that they kind of have to do, but they've lost their love for it. They're sort of like, I don't have a good relationship with food. It's fuel, I'll eat it, but I'd rather not actually. I'm not bothered. And I think that's really sad. So
Yeah.
in both cases, we've removed what is essentially like a core fundamental joy that we as humans get to experience. We've removed that from our culture. And it's interesting, during the pandemic when people started losing their sense of taste and smell,
Yeah.
a few people that I spoke to were just devastated that I'd never realized how much joy the taste of food brought me until I'd lost the sense. And so I think that it's sometimes, that I'm not recommending that that's what we do to like remind people, but it's like, until we reconnect with that joy and reconnect with that pleasure and reprioritize it as something that's actually really positive. So I think one of my key messages is that
Yeah.
food is a powerful tool for us for our health.
Yes.
So actually, it's an ally for us. And
Yeah.
when people
Yeah.
really sort of get that, they're like, oh gosh, okay, I can actually use food to make me feel better today,
Yeah.
to get like help me sleep better tonight, to help me enjoy tomorrow more, and also for me in 10 years' time to be still be thriving. So it's this
Yeah.
hugely powerful, positive tool, actually.
It is. It
And
is.
that's the first step, I think, in reconnecting with food.
Yeah, I love that. I want to hop right in because I have a million questions. I loved, and I'd never heard of it talked about this way. Do you want to speak to the first 1,000 days, or as you call it, the golden window of opportunity?
Yes. So the first 1,000 days is very much like a term that's been coined by researchers who have identified this really crucial time period between conception and second birthday, which is roughly 1,000 days, give or take, depending on whether a child is born prematurely or not. But essentially, they like this is real period of extreme sensitivity to exposures, right?
Hmm.
And there's plenty of research on this. It's sometimes called the golden window of opportunity from public health, like where my background is in public health. And it's called that because when you intervene at that level, at that time frame, you can get really massively positive outcomes. So when we think about global health,
Hmm.
and we try to get the best return of investment for interventions, we know that intervening in the golden window in this first 1,000 days can have really beneficial impacts for the mother and for their offspring, basically. So it's not new and it's not something I invented. there's lots of research that is also sometimes called developmental origins of health and disease, so DOHAD hypothesis. And it really talks to this idea that because between conception and second birthday, you go from two cells, germ cells, an egg and a sperm, to a fully formed person. Now, obviously, we all know this conceptually, right? But when you think about that, every tissue, every organ, every cell differentiation that's gone from like these two gametes meeting to creating an eyeball differently to an ear, differently to a liver, like it's wild, right? And essentially, when a baby is born, the vast majority of the cell differentiations have already happened.
That's incredible.
There's only a handful of cell differentiations, mostly related to reproductive organs that happen after birth, right? So we create this entire human being in our womb. We create an entire new organ to support that. Like a placenta is an organ that does not exist aside from in pregnancy.
Right.
It's an entire organ structure that is created just for this purpose. And then we create this entire person in our womb. And so when you think about it, there's this opportunity to provide the best possible building materials for this foundation of a person. And, we're thinking about the blueprint of what this person's future health will be. It is not a decisive, like, that's it. By the time you're 2, doesn't matter what you do after that, your fate is sealed. But it's more of if we think about this as building a home, right? You have the architect, you have the blueprint, you draw the drawings, and then you lay the foundations, and you have created, say you create the external structure, you know how many bedrooms you have, bathrooms, you know the square footage, right? Then you can choose to decorate, you can choose to maybe replace the doors, but really that structural foundation and how strong the foundations of the house are, that's really in this window. And so we also know that because it's so sensitive, you can actually have a really big impact on long-term health outcomes at this stage. So there's research that shows how maternal diet can directly impact the likelihood of the child developing type 2 diabetes later in life, or of developing, or of having what kind of height they might be. So of course, a lot of that is genetic, but also how have they been nourished?
Wow.
The obesity, actually schizophrenia, so mental health disorders, psychiatric disorders, and also learning, IQ, I mean, name it, allergy, so many things.
Well, I couldn't get over how you wrote about how in the 3rd trimester, the taste buds are being formed. So what you're eating, that's incredible. That's so cool.
Yeah. So in the 3rd trimester, baby's tasting the amniotic fluid, and the amniotic fluid contains any sort of flavor molecules that you may have eaten. So garlic, broccoli, so especially the stronger flavors. And there's some nice data to show that mothers who eat these foods regularly in pregnancy, essentially the babies are much more likely to accept them when they go to eat themselves, because it's already sort of been tasted before, it's familiar. And, I think one important thing as well to note here is that the first 1,000 days relates to maternal nutrition a lot. It also relates to exposures like exercise, stress. Stress is huge. Yeah. Smoking, alcohol, it goes without saying, please, those are not good for a developing baby. But let's also remember that paternal exposure conception.
Yes. I was going to bring that up because you talk about that more than I've read, and culturally we feel blamed, right? We can't get too old. It's just our eggs, but truly so much of this has to do with the quality of the sperm. And you talk about that at great length as well, which I really appreciated.
Because I think often, and I work with women who will often come to me when they're sort of about to undergo fertility treatment or trying to conceive. And inevitably I say, okay, so how are you planning to conceive? Is it a sperm donor? Is it a partner? And now if it's a partner, I'm like, where are they? Because they need to be here too, right? And it's but no, I don't know, actually. So it takes 2 to tango. It's 50-50. Now, it is true that maternal exposure and paternal exposure have different effects. But
Yes.
we also know, for example, that paternal health, things like BMI and mental health, have a
Hmm.
much bigger impact on the relative risk of things like mental health disorders, psychiatric disorders, way
Oh,
more than
wow.
maternal. So when
Wow.
we're thinking about paternal age, actually, paternal age starts to affect sperm quality and child outcome from the age of 35 onwards. So like, men's windows are not wildly different, okay?
Yeah.
It's true that for women it starts to decline from 30 onwards. But for men, like 35, 5 years later, they're already on the downhill. So
Yeah.
so the point of that being, if you are if you're going to conceive with a partner, both of you have to have this awareness of how important your lifestyle is and your diet is for the potential success of the pregnancy and of the health of the child, right, or the
Hmm.
children.
Hmm. Yeah.
And actually, for those who do use sperm donors, the screening is kind of done for them, actually, because you have to, like, men have to essentially, when they're sperm donors, they have to be non-smokers. They have to report how much alcohol they drank recently, and they do screen for morphology of the sperm
Oh,
before
wow.
they actually. So you have almost have like a bit of extra screening when you're using a sperm donor. But I'm not suggesting everyone should do that, but it's like let's remember that paternal health, paternal diet, paternal exposures have just as much of an importance as maternal health. Now, whilst the mother is pregnant, right? Of course, that is a really important period,
Yes.
and we should be focusing a hell of a lot more on supporting women through
Yes.
pregnancy
Yes. Yeah.
and giving them what they need to get all of the ideal nutrition, ideal exposures. So giving them access to regular checkups and making sure they can access safe spaces to exercise and to move their bodies, and nutritious food, because that will be so beneficial. But even preconception care is something that is not spoken about enough. But let's start with this first. Let's get
Yes.
people more aware of this, and then we can really hopefully move to increasing the understanding of the importance of these magic 90 days preconception, where we have a window to impact egg maturation and sperm maturation in this 90-day window that goes towards making that baby.
I love it. And the another thing you bring up that I really found so important, you talk about 1 in 4 pregnancies are lost in the first trimester. And I'm in my early 40s. So many of my I have no kids. I've never been pregnant, but so many of my closest friends have a few kids and have had a few miscarriages. And to be the support system to that has been devastating. So it's something we don't talk a lot about. And it made me really happy to open the page to see the dietary recommendations for pregnancy loss. Like the fact that we're talking about that and you're sharing that, I think when we talk about supporting women, like this is so incredibly important. Is there anything you want to impart or share just about how that period of life when that, so many women actually go through that? Are there tips that you can share?
Yeah, so I mean, so many women have gone through it. I myself have lost a pregnancy before. It is absolutely devastating, right? So I think the first thing is knowing that you're not alone, and that actually there are so many women that you already know that you maybe didn't know have gone through it. And to allow yourself to grieve, because
Hmm.
for many women, it's like when they hear that it's common, it happens quite a lot. They're like, oh, well, I should be fine then. It's like, no, allow yourself to grieve, go through the process, because even if you lost a pregnancy early, so in the first trimester, even if it was only 6 weeks, maybe, you still in that time you will have developed a bond and a thought process and an idea of what this could mean for your life.
Mhm.
So giving yourself time to grieve is really important. And then remember that actually it is quite, depending on when the loss is, but it's the physical changes have already taken place, and your body has already started to respond to that pregnancy. So give your body time to physiologically readjust before thinking about whether you want to try again, or whether it's something you want to go for. I think often women can sometimes be pushed into going straight back in,
Yeah.
and like realistically there's statistically not a huge advantage to that. So give yourself time to heal, give your body time to heal as well, especially if you had to have maybe surgical removal, which
Hmm.
happens quite a lot. um, Give yourself that time to recover and to heal, before you consider what to do next. And always reach out. There's quite a lot of really good support networks out there, charities. Actually, I think now in the UK, some employers are giving like leave
Oh,
for
that's great.
pregnancy loss. Yeah, so that's really good. Find out what you need to do for yourself, get some therapy if you need it, but just really, be aware that it's a possibility. I think that also
Hmm.
helps to
Yeah.
awareness. And then
Yeah.
if it happens to you, just reach out for help and look after yourself properly because
Yeah.
it is a trauma. Yeah.
Yeah. It totally is. Thank you for that. So you never think about this, right? You think that you're born and then you grow at a steady pace until you die. And I thought
Yeah.
it was really fascinating to hear about how quickly you grow until about 3, and then it slows down. And then, you brought up a really important point about the teenage years where your brain starts to change in these different ways while we're undergoing stress, while maybe they're eating junk or smoking for the first time or not sleeping. Can you talk a little bit about what happens during that time period?
Yeah, adolescents, man, they are so
It's
outdone.
hard.
Like they're so hard done by. Like there's hardly any research on adolescents compared to every other life stage, and they're like the society sees them as this like kind of annoying age group that you don't really know what to do with, and it's so unfair. Honestly, I think being an adolescent nowadays is super tough. There are so many pressures. I was reading just recently an article about adolescents who are going through sort of A levels, so that's kind of 18 plus moving to university exams type stuff.
Hmm.
These are the kids that had to go through the pandemic and that really terrible time of being home, separated from their peer group, separated from school. They're still suffering with that. Plus,
Yeah.
they have social media to deal with, plus peer pressure. I mean, and the food environment is the worst it's ever been. Adolescents eat the highest amount of ultra processed foods compared to other age groups. So I just think, crikey, like they really need our help here. So this book certainly is a little bit of a. There's other people working in the space, by the way, who are trying to raise this flag of we need to support our adolescents better.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
they do. There's this growth spurt that takes place with puberty. So as soon as you see these increases in growth hormone, testosterone in boys, estrogen. There's a growth spurt involved. So again, there's an opportunity to help build the kind of body composition and strong bones that we want to see for healthy adults. But
Hmm.
crucially, what you just said, Lianna, like the brain structural changes in adolescence are pretty serious. So, in the first years of life, it's all about growth, growth, growth. The brain is huge. Like by the age of 3, we basically have the size of an adult brain. So it's like amazing big structure that's just learning and absorbing and forming neural pathways. And then as you go into later childhood, there's like more of a prefrontal cortex. So children then are able to actually regulate better. They're able to like make less impulsive choices. And then you get to adolescence and there's this like really big structural change and lots of theories around how this happens. Synaptic pruning is one of them, but it's really this
Hmm.
idea that the brain undergoes a change also influenced by sex hormones that really changes people's personalities and like what their priorities are in terms of the pathways
Hmm.
they keep, right? So all of this is happening, plus exam pressure, plus peer pressure, plus social media exposure, and plus exposure to poor food. So
Yeah.
when we look at data about mental health in young people, and so a lot of my work, the majority of my work that I do in public health is actually looking at mental health.
Yeah.
There's this really massive increase in need for mental health support, mental health services for teens and children.
Hmm.
And it's not a huge surprise because when you think about the path to adolescence nowadays, it is not set up for them to be able to thrive.
No,
And
not at all.
nutrition is not the only piece I've mentioned, like social media, pressure, da da da.
Right. Right.
But nutrition is a good safety net to just help dampen the impact of all the other things.
Yeah.
And actually, when we think about brain structure and when we think about being able to concentrate, and when we think about the fact that sleep, circadian rhythms change in adolescence, like all these factors together, if we give adolescents a good diet, it just really helps them to get through it. And at the moment, it's not a priority. So there's work being done to try and improve young children's diets, hopefully soon, and there's more of an awareness of the importance of, I don't know, younger children's diets. But I think with adolescents, often because they also have ability to buy their own food outside of the
Yeah.
home, and actually the school environment, the food there is pretty awful in the US and the UK.
Yes.
That at the moment there's nowhere for them to access food that's really ideal for their growth and for their
Hmm.
development, unless they can have access healthy food at home. And
Hmm.
that's not possible for all adolescents.
Right.
Some parents have to work 2, 3 jobs. They're not at home all the
Hmm.
time. For some families, it's hard to access sort of healthy food options. And so, potentially we have this group of people who are still dependent on their adults to provide food at home. They depend on the schools to provide healthy food. And then they are in a food environment that encourages them to go to the fried chicken shop, that to go to the
Yep.
corner shop and buy whatever energy drink is popular right now.
Yeah.
And no, there's no guardrails. It's just like all happening. And then these people, they like these people, because they're not really children anymore, but they feel crap.
Yeah.
And then they're like,
Yeah.
why do I feel so crap? And so, well, you're being bombarded left, right, and center with things that aren't great for you, actually.
Yeah. Yeah. And I was really horrified. I recovered from bulimia in my 20s. And you think that, and I mean, most women I've worked with, I've, had some degree of disordered eating, but I was pretty shocked to read that hospital admissions for eating disorders have increased by 84% in the past 5 years.
Yeah.
Why do you think that
Yeah.
is?
Well, there's a massive increase in sort of eating and eating disorders, and in children and adolescents, in sort of males as well as females. And
Hmm.
now there's like a new increase in perimenopausal women as well, so older, which is really,
Yeah.
I think it's going back to this idea that food has become something people fear. Now, let's be really
Yeah.
clear here, though, because disordered eating and eating disorders often have a psychological
Yes.
sort of origin, right? So it's not
Yes.
solely about food.
No.
But when you're in a position where, and also I should say, I'm not a specialist in this, so I would always defer to my dietitian colleagues who are specialists in this. But my
Yeah.
understanding from working with people who work in the space is
Hmm.
that when you have a stressful environment anyway,
Hmm.
usually some form of trauma, and then you
Hmm.
have a food environment that actually points to food as the enemy, or food as to something to control, food is something that you
Yeah.
can't just enjoy, it becomes a it becomes a sort of negative tool that people can
Hmm.
then engage with in a way that's obviously not helpful for their health. And I think it's really sad to see that there's this increase across the board. I have to say, I think that social media and the exposure to unrealistic body images and the kind of focus that there is on portraying these sort of figures is really unhelpful on every count.
Yes.
I think it's especially hard for younger men and women to realize that not everybody is structured to look like that, and that
Yeah.
we shouldn't be aiming to achieve that sort of homogeneity. It
And
wouldn't make sense anyway.
no, and how much of that is even real at this point? Like you see there's like AI modeling agencies and you're watching like AI take over and it's hard to tell the difference, I'm sure, especially as young people, right? Where they're idealizing these certain body types and then pair that with all of the stress you talk about and you just spoke about in terms of their lifestyle. I mean, it makes sense, but it's so terrifying.
It is. And it's like, it's also, I think, fundamentally, food is one of the only choices we can make for ourselves. So, in an environment where things feel really out of control, so where you feel like you don't have control about maybe like your school stress, you don't have control about where you live because you live with your caregivers, you don't have control about lots of different things. Sometimes food becomes the only thing you can actually keep a tab
Yeah.
on and control.
Yeah.
And so,
Yeah.
when we when we think about it that way round, it's it's sort of, I think this increase in rates is just so closely linked with the overall increase in stress and
Yeah.
a sort of lack of freedom to feel like you have agency over more things, right?
Yeah.
And so then
Yeah.
food becomes a thing that you can actually exert some agency over, even if it is in a way that's detrimental to health, but at least you have that control.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's kind of the same when you look at other mental health issues. There's an increase across the board, right?
Really?
And yeah. So there's increase in anxiety disorders, increase in depression disorders. There's an increase in suicide rates. There's now a resurgence and increase in addiction disorders. So addiction disorders are actually kind of getting a bit better around 2014, 15, and now there's been another resurgence back up. So they're all symptoms of the same thing,
Yeah.
and that
Yeah.
is the societal stress that we're under, actually. And different people cope with it in different ways or respond to it differently. And a lot of that is down to resilience and also how much past trauma you've experienced. So how much are you having
Yeah.
to deal with in your cup, really?
Yeah. 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 I like that analogy. Yeah. She's a really good analogy in the book, especially as we age, where, what your life has set you up for, you might have a bigger bucket essentially, where
Yeah.
if you were looking at like a faucet going in, you could handle more. Where if your life, you have poorer health, more trauma, your resiliency is, though you may seem healthy, your ability to be resilient is not
Yeah.
as large as someone else. Well, I think
And
this is a really good, oh yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
no, I was going to say, on that analogy, I think the faucet where we can let some of that
Yeah.
out,
Yeah.
that's where we can intervene and help people to increase the faucet capacity. So because we can't control how much is coming into our bucket. And actually the things that impact bucket size are also often out of our control, right?
Yes.
So what can we do is, like, how can we bring in some tools to help people to offload some of that pressure? And there's so many tools. So obviously the one I focus on is a good nutrition, but there
Mhm.
are mindfulness, psychotherapy, exercise, connection, social connection, finding your tribe, essentially. All these
Mhm.
things help to let some of that out. So even if there's like this massive increase in what's coming into your bucket, if you know how to turn that faucet tap up,
Mhm.
you're less likely to sort of end up in a situation
Over.
where the water is overflowing out of your bucket.
Yeah, I love that. And I think it's interesting. I think I see people, we assume we have less control over things that we actually have control over, like sleep and diet, and how much that does affect our mental health and our outlook on life. And then we think we have so much more control over these areas of life, like maybe work or relationships, that maybe we don't. And it's really interesting to empower people in that way, where they start to realize, and you talk about this a lot in the book, of just sort of the gut brain connection and the science behind how now we're seeing, the health of our microbiome. Do you want to, I mean, we can pivot into something a little bit more positive in terms of like what we can do. And I really loved, my backstory, I got very sick in my 20s with some sort of like undiagnosable autoimmune thing. So nearly 15 years ago, I was seeing a lot of doctors in New York. No one could really help me. I started to do my own research, and I found this book on the microbiome that this doctor had written, and he had written this thing called the microbiome diet, and nothing else was really working. So I was like, what the heck? And I spent about 6 months rebuilding my microbiome in my late 20s. And I remember in the first 12 days, years of anxiety and depression disappeared overnight.
Wow.
And I was like, what just happened? Like, I've been out, like, it felt like I'd like jumped out of bed, and like, I went from like black and white to Technicolor, and I was so happy. And I was like, this is crazy. So it's really exciting for me, reading the end of your book, where you were talking so much about like how this is because this was weird science back then. And everyone's like, what are you doing?
Yeah,
What
I
is
was like,
this? What are you
what book is
talking
that?
about?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's called
Amazing.
The Microbiome Diet. Raphael Kelman, he was based in New York. And this was like, like 15 years ago or something.
That's
and
really ahead of
everyone
time.
thought I was a weirdo. Everyone thought I was a weirdo, but I just literally had nothing. They didn't know. They're like, you could take steroids, you could go in. Like, I had a bunch of doctors just telling me they didn't have a clue. So I was like, let me just do this weird science experiment on my body. And then that's how I ended up in this whole field, because I was I was an actor at the time. And so think about having, gut dysbiosis and having to go do a scene where you're accessing your emotional life. You can't,
Yeah.
right? And all of a sudden I was like, wait, no wonder I'm not booking any jobs. Like, my gut's a mess. So here I'm like telling all these people, and everyone's like, what are you talking about? But the fact
She's lost
this
the
is
plot.
nuts. I'm like, I know. I'm like, there are these bugs. They live in your intestines. They control everything. Everyone's like, sure, okay. But do you want to talk? I was just really exciting to hear you just celebrate and talk about sauerkraut. Do you want to speak to the microbiome and just like what we're knowing about the gut brain connection? And this is finally like infiltrating sort of our modern language and understanding of how we can take care of ourselves.
Yeah, definitely. So I think microbiome science has been around for a while, but as you said, it's not been popular science. But
No.
it's really interesting because I think for a long time we knew that like diet can really affect health. And we're like, we think it's because of the micronutrients, but it really didn't explain the extent of that. And so now there's this big realization that the gut microbiome composition, so what microbes are in there? Like, have you got a really cool, diverse microbiome with lots of really helpful guys in there? Or do you have like a microbiome that has quite a lot of unhelpful characters? So it's not just about diversity, but it's about like who's in your team, right? So now we know that the microbial composition which is directly impacted by what we ingest. So if you think about this as a forest or a garden, the environment of that forest or garden basically dictates whether there's going to be flourishing plants with flowers and bees everywhere, or if it's going to be essentially barren, right? This is the same thing. Our gut microbiome is an ecosystem of its own, and it interacts. So there's trillions of microbes in there. There's bacteria, there's viruses, there's phages, there's parasites, there's all sorts going on. And what we chuck down our tube, essentially, directly impacts that ecosystem. And now we realize that ecosystem is the mediator of the impact that our diet has. So yes, of course, like macronutrients impact our health at sort of liver level, where what's absorbed into the liver and how it's distributed is impactful. But when you really look at these other effects on the brain, on mental health, on lung health, on skin health, crikey, like the impact of diet on skin is amazing. You can see a change in people who suffer with things like psoriasis or eczema, atopic allergies. You can change their lives in a couple of weeks. I've got some amazing clients that I work with one-on-one who sort of come to me as a last resort because they're like, I don't know where to go. And after just a couple of weeks, they are calling me. They're like, we don't know what you've done, but my psoriasis is finally starting to reverse. It's clearing after one of my clients, I love her. She was basically in tears because she's been battling with psoriasis since childhood. So she was juvenile psoriasis from the age of 11. And she's in her mid 40s now. And it's the first time that it's actually improved. And
that's incredible.
That's not to say that I've done anything magic, by the way. It's just that nobody had thought to change her diet. So she'd had lots of treatments, including really advanced medicines. But the diet really fundamentally changed her quality of life and the severity of her psoriasis. So the gut microbiome produces chemicals for us. It creates hundreds of chemicals for us that all impact our health. Now, if these guys are helpful, then the chemicals they're creating for us are helpful for us too. And we're thinking about things like neurotransmitters, which then directly impact the vagus nerve. The enteric nervous system is this huge collection of neurons around our gut. That's why it's called the second brain. And they feed into the vagus nerve, which is this massive cable with lots of neurons that travels from our brain to other organs, but mostly to the gut. And these neurotransmitters then basically talk to the vagus nerve. They're like, okay, this is what's going on, like, here's what we're doing. And that then directly impacts how the neurotransmitters in our brain are created. So it's just, when it's just a bit, it's mind-blowing when you think about it. There's so much wonderful research on the gut microbiome and the brain, the gut-brain axis. Professor John Crean is like just awesome. He's like, I feel like he's the chief of this research. And then there's people like Professor Felice Jacka, who have done so much work on nutritional psychiatry. So like, can we actually improve psychiatric patients with nutrition? And yes, we can. Like, we can really improve the quality of life, but also objective markers of mental health can be improved with dietary intervention. And the gut microbiome is the key to this, is the key mediator that directly influences these outcomes. And I think that's so exciting because the gut microbiome can be changed. You can't change your genes. You can only blame your parents for your genes. But when it comes to the microbiome, within 2 days, in randomized controlled trials where they've given people high doses of spices or where they've given them like extra fiber, extra plants, within 2 days, they measure changes in gut microbiome signature. Like, what's going on in there? What are you producing? Are you making more short-chain fatty acids? And let's not forget, moving my table, let's not forget as well that the gut microbiome and the gut health in general is critical for immune system function.
Yes.
80% of our immune system lies around the gut outside, waiting for signals from the gut microbiome. Is anything going on? Do we need to respond? Do we need to put inflammation up? Are there any pathogens? What allergens are there, right? So we cannot have a healthy immune system without a healthy gut microbiome. Now, you mentioned that you were suffering sort of autoimmune-like conditions.
Yes. Yeah.
And then you ate a microbiome diet and you were better.
Yes.
It makes sense. The gut microbiome is directly related to immune system function. The two are inextricably linked. So I just think that this whole field, and I'm really lucky because working with Zoe, they are leading the way in understanding how the gut microbiome impacts health. And they're leading the way in understanding exactly how we can change gut microbiome composition with diet. Of course, we know that more plants, more fiber, more plant diversity is key, but really understanding the mechanisms, understanding the populations of microbes across different populations in the world, that's where I get like super excited. and then really being able to point to how the microbiome has mediated some of the health improvements or health outcomes. I think it's just magical. It's a magical time. It's a magical time to be working in this field for sure.
Yeah, I think it's really exciting too. So on that note, I know you're big on the Mediterranean diet, and we know you're Italian, but there's so many studies, it sounds like, that back this up. When we talk about, obviously nutrition is bio-individual depending on what's going on in your body, your taste, your budgets, where you live. But overall, will you speak to what are the best diets, especially as we pivot into longevity, aging, menopause, right? I think what's cool I've found is it seems to be very similar, right? Maybe more of one thing, less of the other, but through a lot of phases of life to support healing health, mental health, gut health, it seems to be a lot of the similar things. So tell us what you recommend to your clients.
Yeah, exactly. So you've just touched on a really important point here. There are some fundamental truths that are beneficial for everyone. So think of this as the nutrition cupcake, which is a bit counterintuitive, but let's go with it. The cake bit, the base of the cupcake, right? That is fairly similar for everybody. So eat more plants, increase your fiber, more diversity of plants. Try to eat things that are local and seasonal to you where available. Whole foods, the majority of the diet from whole foods, right? Those things, not groundbreaking, not novel, but they will literally apply to 99% of the population will benefit from doing these things. 9 out of 10 adults in the UK and the US are fiber deficient.
Yeah.
Deficient, right? Eat more fiber is going to benefit 9 out of 10 people. So those are the kind of cupcake. Then you have the icing, which is like the stratification. But that's where we think about actually in childhood, children need like a bit more of the nutrient density, and they really need to concentrate on like quality protein for tissue building, all these things. Then you stratify up and you think, oh, pregnant women, oh, really need to look at omega-3 intake and iron levels. So there's stratification, which is the icing, and it's looking at individual groups of people who generally have quite similar needs for that phase of life. And we're lacking that at the moment. So actually, we're lacking the cupcake, to be fair. So the cupcake still needs a lot of work.
Yes.
So the cupcake needs a lot of work. And that message needs to be repeated again and again and again. And the Mediterranean diet is the best understood cupcake base. When I meet people who say to me, it's so confusing, there's so much contradictory advice, what should I listen to? Anyone who's done 5 minutes of actual scientific research in nutrition or in public health or in epidemiology will know that there is no other dietary pattern that has as much research behind it, that is as clearly evidence-based as the Mediterranean diet. Now, what does that mean? It doesn't mean that you have to follow a specific dietary plan. Go and look up the Mediterranean dietary pyramid, right? And all it tells you is what proportion of your diet should come from each food group. Vegetables, leafy greens, whole grains, nuts and seeds and pulses and legumes are the majority of your plate. Then you have a little bit of dairy, if you want it, some oily fish, maybe 3 times a week. And then you have some lean meat, if you want it. And right at the top, you've got sweets and some red meat occasionally. So it's the proportion of foods. It doesn't matter what part of the world you're from. You can get whatever vegetables that are available to you. The only ingredient that's a bit non-negotiable is extra virgin olive oil. That seems to have it has its own special powers. So where possible, extra virgin if you can. If you can't, virgin olive oil is also fine. Better if it's extra virgin, but the prices are a bit crazy at the moment. So I always recommend to people, if you can't afford the extra virgin olive oil, go for the virgin olive oil. It's still better in terms of nutritional profile than, say, a canola oil, which I'm not anti that, but it just doesn't have the same profile. And then, so that's the stratification then, is saying, okay, Mediterranean dietary pattern, great. And what other things should I focus on for my time of life and for my background? That's the stratification. And then the cherry on the cupcake is the personalization. And that's where, if it's available to you, finding out exactly how your body responds to specific metabolic challenges. Are you someone who's actually fairly well equipped to deal with more fat in your diet? Are you someone who's actually fairly well equipped to have more freely available sugars in your diet or starches? Or are you somebody who actually your metabolism is kind of struggling to respond appropriately to those challenges? Finding that out, that's where the personalization comes in. But it's really about getting the cupcake and the icing done first. If you start from the personalization and work down, you still have to do the groundwork. So you can, if you want, you can come in at the top, but you're still going to have to do the groundwork. And so it's about getting that message out. And the Mediterranean diet, in my opinion, is the best evidence-based, but also it's the one that people can kind of relate to, and they can get an understanding of it. It's a primarily whole food, plant-based dietary pattern with some oily fish, extra virgin olive oil. And it really focuses on the diversity of plants, the nuts, the seeds, the legumes, the beans, the whole grains, which most people do not consume enough of. I talk to, I'm lucky to talk to lots of people. Hardly anyone eats whole grains every day. Hardly anyone eats nuts and seeds every day. And actually, when you start adding those foods back into your life, you feel less hungry. You eat less processed, ultra-processed foods, right? Yes. You eat less of a pre-packaged situation because actually you suddenly have way more available to you. And by the way, tinned beans, nuts and seeds, dried whole grains are affordable. Yeah. We do not need to be spending £200 or $300 on some crazy superfood. There is no such thing. You don't need to do that. You can get your random bag of mixed nuts and seeds, which are always cheaper than the individual nuts and seeds, which is quite funny because you want the diversity. So buy those. Buy the tinned beans. Preferably they're tinned in water, right, as opposed to any sauce. But still, buy the tinned beans. Keep them in your cupboard. Use them for a quick lunch. It's just about rethinking what easy food is. None of this has to be difficult, and actually it doesn't need to be expensive, but we need to reframe it. Get the frozen berries, get the frozen spinach, the frozen peas. And where it becomes tricky is for people who don't have access to storage for their foods. And so really thinking about that, and what does that mean in terms of helping everybody to be able to access more of these foods. Then we go into societal structure and making sure everyone has affordable housing and actually can access foods. It's a bit of a broader topic, but let's remind as many people as possible that these foods should be available to them, and they can achieve a healthier dietary pattern without having to put their finances in more pressure, like at risk, basically.
Yeah. And the other thing I want to add to this too is they can be really delicious. I think we get really addicted to ultra processed foods. Your taste buds change. But when you start eating more whole foods and you add things like garlic and onions and, nice spices and have fresh ingredients, sometimes it's so much more delicious and satisfying and simple, I think, than people think.
Listen, herbs, spices can transform. So you can get like a plain tin of butter beans, right? But when you put some paprika in there, some salt, some lemon juice, you maybe like add a little bit of like fresh chopped parsley in there. Like you can transform that and it's delicious and you will want to eat more of it. Same with whole grains, right? Whole grains you can replace your white rice with a barley or with like a buckwheat, or and then you can batch cook it and add some spices to it, add some color to it. And it's something that's so much better for you. And, listen, quinoa is like expensive and it's shishi, and I guess, but barley and spelt, man, they do not have good PR. They're pretty cheap. So it's just that people don't necessarily think of them as an option, and they can be so delicious. You're so right. Yes.
I know we're almost at time, and I have two more really quick questions.
Yeah.
One, because you have another book that's incredible. It's a great book about menopause. It has wonderful recipes. Before I lose you, I have so many women in this category as clients. Can you give us a couple of tips to how to support a healthy menopause? Because it is such a challenging time. And you really I know this because I've heard this over and over from clients, but they talk about, I've been eating the same foods and now all of a sudden I feel so different and my body feels alien to me or it's changing. What kind of support or tips can you give to those women?
So first of all, I think it's really important to point out that menopause causes a true physiological metabolic change. So that change is very real. It is not in your head. It is not just aging. Right? I hate that. Oh, you're just getting older.
Yeah.
No. It's like a fundamental physiological and metabolic change. So the way your metabolism literally deals with the same food you ate sort of 5 years ago, 1 year ago, it's completely different. So we did the Zoe menopause study, which looked exactly at this and saw significant differences between pre, peri, and postmenopausal women. It's a change. It's a shift. We know that some of that change is mediated by the gut microbiome. There are microbes that are really estrogen sensitive. And when our estrogen levels start to decline, they are unhappy and they die off. And the ecosystem of your gut biome replaces them with what's available. So one of the best ways we can support that change and support the metabolic changes as well is to eat a diet that's really high in whole plants. Fiber is your friend. And green leafy veg, carrots, mushrooms, aubergines, tomatoes, name it, chickpeas, beans, whole grains, eat more of those foods. And postmenopausal women are more likely to choose sort of a higher energy density, higher sugar foods, probably because they're knackered, because their sleep is rubbish and all sorts of things. So being aware of that, being aware that you're more likely to choose those foods is the first step in sort of creating a food environment at home and making foods available to you that are more supportive of health, so that when you get hungry, the first thing you reach for is more nourishing. And then, of course, have your biscuit as well, have whatever you need as well. Food is also sort of, it doesn't just act as nutrition, of course. There are some times when you just want to have some dark chocolate or you want to have your ice cream, but just take the opportunity to nourish yourself first. And then the other thing that I'm, I feel really strongly about and that is really important is that alcohol is not our friend, especially when we
Yeah.
go through this change. It
Yeah.
really isn't. It makes all menopausal symptoms worse. And our risk of disease postmenopausally with alcohol increases. So a lot of the women I work with in this time can make quite a big impact on their quality of life just by cutting out drinking or reducing it quite
Yeah.
drastically.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was surprised. You have a table of drugs essentially, and
Yeah.
alcohol is by far the worst, and almost it's like 2/3 as dangerous as heroin was the next one. And I,
Yeah.
looking at that alone, it was like, okay, I need to rethink this relationship, because I think culturally we all think it's just fine and everyone does it, but
Yeah.
truly it's so dangerous. And even like in the UK, they talk about, oh, you can have like a glass of wine or two with pregnancy, but then you're like, this is a neurotoxin, why would you ever do that? And it's like, that makes sense. So
It is a
being mindful of
carcinogenic neurotoxin that's as harmful to ourselves as it is to society. Now, do I drink occasionally? Yes. Do I have a glass of red wine? Yes. Do I also have a very nourishing diet? Do I also eat foods that nourish me 80% of the time? Yes. So I'm not saying that nobody should ever drink again. I think that's not going to happen. But just be mindful of what alcohol is. And then if you are going to drink, make sure you have that nutrition cupcake base sorted first, because your diet will help to like minimize the impact of the drinking. So like it'll all get dealt with because your liver's amazing and your body's amazing. But know that it's not something that's actually directly beneficial. Sure, it brings people together and it's festive, which is nice, but it is not a health food, and it doesn't help us as we age, actually.
Yeah. And finally, we ask all
Yes.
of our guests, when times get a little tough, when life hands you lemons, how do you love
Yeah.
through it? Meaning, how do you pick yourself back up? What's your number one tool? And I always say the first thing that comes to mind is usually the best.
Oh, that's so funny. So I think I had a really bad year where I lost my first pregnancy, and I lost my dad within 2 weeks.
Oh, wow. I'm so
And
sorry.
it was bad. Yeah, it was a bad time.
Yeah, that's
And, I
awful.
think I got through it by just taking it one day at a time.
Oh,
So
that's beautiful.
I really just got through the day. I did what I needed to do for myself just to get through it. And
Mhm.
eventually time passes and you can grow from that place.
Yeah.
But I think it's just take it slow, take it one day at a time, do what you need to do. And that looks different for everybody, right? So for
Yeah.
me,
Yeah.
I went back to work really soon because for
Mhm.
me, doing my work helped me to process
Mhm.
in the background until I was ready to
Mhm.
process in the foreground.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
be follow your gut instinct, do what it is you need to do for you, and just take one step at a time, one day at a time, on your timeline. Nobody else can tell you how you need to go through any kind of trauma or healing. You've got to do it at your own pace, but keep doing the work as well. Don't just block it out, because that shit will come out sideways later.
It will. Thank you. That is brilliant advice. Everything you've shared today is going to be so helpful to our listeners. Tell people where they can find you online. The book is called Everybody Should Know This, and I believe everybody should read this. I'm excited. Yes, yes, yes. It's incredible. Where can people find you online?
So I'm on social media, Dr Fede Amati. I have a website if you need to try and book some time with me. I feel like I'm doing like a book tour in the UK at the moment. So I'll be at Bath Festival, Hay Festival, Science Museum, all these kinds of things. And yeah, I mean, I think online is where most people will come across me. The book is available on Amazon, Waterstones, all booksellers in the UK. And hopefully, I'm hoping that soon I will have a US publisher. If anyone's listening to this, please get in touch so that I
Yes, do
can
it.
have it in the US, available in the US and other countries too. So yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's been such a pleasure, and you're an amazing host. And I just think you're awesome, to be honest.
I mean, feeling is mutual. This is such a really beautiful piece of literature, we're going to call it, that everyone will make people so much healthier. So everyone go out and buy it. Order it from the UK, everyone in the US. Read
You
it.
can do that. It's a bit tricky, but sure.
Oh, Can you get it? Can you get it on eventually
So
like
you
Audible?
can, yes, it's on Audible and it's me reading
Okay,
it,
great.
which was actually quite hard to do, can I just say? But yeah, you can
Yeah.
actually, so
Oh
if you
yeah,
go
yeah.
to amazon.co.uk, so if you go to the UK Amazon, you can choose postal delivery to the US. But of course, it's like more money to have it delivered to the US, which is why I'm hoping that eventually it'll just be available on US Amazon too.
Oh, good. Good, 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 good. Well, thank you. And you would see people remotely if people in
Yeah.
beyond the UK want to reach out to you. Great, great, great. So yeah,
Yeah.
you
So
guys, if she
well-founded
said,
health
yeah.
is
Oh
the
yes, and
difference.
we had Jack on, and that was such a brilliant podcast as
Oh, there
well.
you
So
go. Yeah.
yeah, everyone, reach out to her. She'll change your life. This book will change your life. Get it. And thank you so much again.
Thanks for having me. Have a lovely day.
You too.